Now that Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is out and to great success, I feel compelled to make this video as both a discussion and also as a way to check in with the modern Western landscape of video games, to really try and analyze how it is that Veilguard managed to flop so hard. If you haven't heard, following the rather poor sales of Veilguard, BioWare has been forced to lay off their entire Dragon Age team, leaving behind only Mass Effect-focused staff for the foreseeable future. And these layoffs include people who have been working at BioWare for 20 plus years and have worked on all the Dragon Ages and more. It's generally, quite evil, but unfortunately, not surprising. Let's talk about why by comparing Veilguard's fundamental philosophy, as a sequel to two great sequels, Baldur's Gate 3 and Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. If you're new here, welcome. I talk about video games on this channel, usually things like Let's Plays or retrospectives, but basically it's whatever I want to talk about. My day job is actually working in video game development professionally. I have a degree in it, yada yada yada. So not only am I somebody who's a very deep fan of a lot of these Western RPG series, but I also am keenly aware of things like developer perspective. And as someone who is aware of developer perspective, I know very intimately that layoffs are bad. The past 2 years have seen a massive bubble burst in the game dev space, and I've had multiple very close personal friends be affected and lose their jobs that are really hard to get in the first place from major studios. But like I said, the response to Veilguard was so bad that it makes unfortunate sense that EA as a corporation would push for something as drastic as layoffs. They did release metrics about how the concurrent player stats for Veilguard were about 1.5 million concurrent players, and that was half of their target metric of 3 million. But using a metric like concurrent players is a very strange stat when talking about the success of a single-player RPG like Dragon Age: The Veilguard. It kind of makes no sense, actually. Normally and logically, one would measure the success of a single-player game by simply talking about units sold. It doesn't matter how many people are playing because you don't have to populate servers. But that is frankly a much more minor gripe than the totally out-of-touch statement by the CEO that the game failed because it didn't have enough live service elements. I can't imagine a more disturbingly untrue and frankly ignorant thing to say about a series like Dragon Age. Like, nobody who has played these games wants a live service element to them. But clearly also, given the concurrent player stat usage, EA is feeling a little Fortnite pilled right now, but that's issue like 1 of 1,000. But let's talk about a bigger issue with Veilguard that I think actually led to its failure, where other games have been able to succeed and soar: philosophy. I'll use Baldur's Gate 3 and Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 as my basis for comparison, because all three games have a ton of similarities kind of fundamentally. They're all recent, really big releases in the Western RPG scene, and they all rely on having compelling narratives that are affected by player choice. They are all a medieval fantasy setting to a degree, though Kingdom Come is a little bit light fantasy, but still, they're adjacent. And they're all sequels, that's the big one. So they all come with a set of expectations in the context of their series. And importantly, I'm gonna bring up that all three of these sequels are more woke than their previous iterations, as a way to kind of stomp out that being a point of contention in this discussion. As a way to say, wokeness is not a game killer. If you're the kind of person who complains about that, then you really need to work on a more eloquent argument. A much better complaint that one could make if they actually played the games would be to bring up something like how I did in my Dragon Age retrospective series, that Veilguard in particular chooses to present its LGBTQ plus conversation topics using more jarringly modern terminology. Not that the discussion is happening at all, right? All of the games have touched on them. So to say inherently that wokeness being present in these games at all is what's making them not successful is not true with two of them. And then for Veilguard, it might be a presentation issue, but it's not that it's just there. They've all had them. So just wanted to get that out of the way. What is the actual difference in philosophy that divides these games' reception so much? I think it's their approach to handling series expectations from the ground up. You know, from a very fundamental level. Baldur's Gate 3 is a sequel to a BioWare game that came out 2 decades ago. But nonetheless, the series had a long-term fundamental appeal of being an accurate and engaging simulation of a Dungeons and Dragons tabletop experience, but in a video game format, right? That includes concepts like building a unique individual character and having them engage with a sprawling world, along with your band of very different and independently interesting companions that all have their own motives and responses to things, and the ability to role play in the world and with your companions and build relationships as any way you see fit, you know, aligning to your individual character morality and interests. If these are the fundamental goals and philosophies and appeals of the Baldur's Gate franchise, then of course Baldur's Gate 3 meets and exceeds these expectations fabulously. And thus, by maintaining the core ideas and goals of that original series appeal, and then exceeding that and building on that with 20 years of difference, Baldur's Gate 3 banged. It was a huge success, you know, game of the year. Then we get to Kingdom Come 2. Its gap between 1 and 2 is a lot smaller, it's only a few years, but it too achieves its goals fabulously. Kingdom Come 1 was a brutal, realistic, medieval life simulator that had fun, goofy, silly side quests and character interactions, and a serious and gripping overall plot and narrative that was affected by player choice in the form of Henry. So it had this beautiful balance of life sim, serious narrative, and goofy side quests. And of course, once again, 2 does everything that the first game did, and more, and better. More life sim elements, bigger cities to explore, more romances, a more player choice dependent narrative than last time. So again, people love it, it's good. And then we look at Veilguard. Dragon Age has been a series that has always been interested in player choice, romances, and a grand, mature narrative. The sequels have always done their best to respect previous player choices and incorporate them into the game world, but at the same time, all of the games have a high variance of things like setting and combat style and presentation. And yet, despite being released 10 years after the last series entry, Veilguard does not unanimously improve all of these aspects that made the original 3 so iconic. It does improve things like visuals and combat, but those aspects of the game have nothing to do with the core appeal of the previous entries. Yes, the conflict of the narrative is grand, and you do have a set of interesting companions to get to know, like last time, but the player choice and romance seem to have taken a back burner in terms of the goals of Veilguard, leaving it feeling like the weakest in those aspects of the entire franchise. Some might argue that combat and exploration have always been core aspects to the Dragon Age experience, but I would counter that by saying that people don't look back on Origins for the combat or the exploration. If you played that game, especially nowadays, it plays horribly. That's not why you're playing it. I mean, maybe 1 in 1,000 might feel that way, but generally, people look back on Origins for the grand nature of how each playthrough felt so epic in scope and so customizable. You know, how all of your choices really affected the outcome of that game. Because that's what people liked. The player agency and freedom, the weight and respect of your choices, and the fun of getting to know your companions and affecting the world. Not running around in the fade. Basically, what I'm getting at is a lesson that BioWare and other studios have seemingly been totally unable to get in the last decade or so. Arguably, the last good game, pretty unanimously well-received game that BioWare came out with was the last Dragon Age game, Dragon Age Inquisition, with everything else coming out after seeming to add to the studio's infamy rather than success. And it's a testament to their historic prowess as a development studio that they've been able to last so long making games that seem to miss the fundamental spark of their older titles, right? It's one thing to experiment and try new things and evolve presentation, but it simply cannot come at the cost of the fundamental core philosophy of why people like these games. Kingdom Come 1 was a great game, and now its sequel is a great sequel because it did everything the last game did, better and more of it, right? Baldur's Gate 3 was a generation-defining success in the Western RPG space because it did everything that people loved about the last games, but better and more. Veilguard was a flop, despite some aspects being better, because none of those aspects were the aspects that make BioWare games memorable. So basically, this whole video is just a vain attempt to succinctly convey a kind of warning to anybody who wants to make a sequel to a beloved game in the future. You cannot forget the core aspects of what people really love about your game. Like, if BioWare made only visual novels forevermore, where all they have to focus on is the story and the characters and the romance, and don't worry about the combat or an open world or anything, I am almost completely certain that those would be better received than anything they've put out in the last decade. And this is really not to knock anybody who has worked at BioWare, and especially not to knock people who were laid off. This is more so a call out to corporate CEOs and leash holders who delusionally think that what people want in these video games is more world, more filler, more loot box, more live service. That's fundamentally not what people want, actually. I am weary about the low likelihood of ever seeing another Dragon Age game, at least one developed by BioWare, despite how much love the series has had. But I'm also thankful for the successful sequels that we've seen that really take the heart and soul and the core appeal of their previous entries so seriously to great success. If this simple video ends up being a forum for people to discuss their thoughts, or maybe a historical marking point that people can look back on to see how people felt about the state of games at this particular time, that would be a great honor to me, honestly. So thanks for watching, and if you like the sound of my voice, I have a ton of other content on this channel of varying styles about all of these series and more. So stay tuned for whatever I feel like discussing next, and thanks again for watching.